In Chapter 16, we are going to look at one of the most important turning points in U.S. history, and that is the rise of industrial America. So this is the moment when the United States really transforms from a mostly rural agricultural society into a modern industrial power. And that transformation changes almost everything: how people work, where they live, how wealth is created, and who holds power. So let's start with big picture. After the Civil War, the United States had experienced rapid industrial growth. Factories expanded, cities grew, new technologies emerged, and by then the entire economy became more connected and more complex. So by the early 1900s, what we see is the United States had become one of the leading industrial powers in the world. But what made this possible? So I've listed here a few key developments that I would like for you to remember. So first we have railroads. Railroads were the backbone of industrialization, so they connected different parts of the country into one national market. They allowed raw materials and finished goods to move quickly across long distances, and they didn't just move products, they created the demand for those products. So railroads required steel, coal, wood, iron, so industries producing those materials, they're going to expand very quickly. And railroads didn't just support industrialization, they drove it. So here are the miles of track that we had laid. This is, 1865, the war has ended. So this is about 5 years later, about 50,000 miles. 10 years later, we're almost doubling it. We're almost to 100,000. 10 years later, look how much we've laid, and then over 200,000 by the year 1900, by the turn of the century. So railroads, what they do is they also force standardization. So in 1886, the U.S. adopted standard time zones, so trades could run on consistent schedules. That might sound like a really small thing, but it shows how that was all by industrialization. It reshaped everyday life. Innovation. Industrialization was powered by new inventions and technologies. So you're going to read about these, but the Bessemer process, which made steel cheaper and faster to produce, the telephone, which transformed communication, office tools like the typewriter, which increased efficiency, electrical lighting, which allowed factories to operate longer hours and into the dark, and then petroleum, which became a major new energy source. And inventors like Nikola Tesla, Thomas Edison, they all played huge roles in this transformation. So by the end of the 1800s, and here's a picture of Edison and his little crew that you're going to read more about these guys and what they're doing at Menlo Park. But by the end of the 1800s, the U.S. economy was larger, faster, more connected, and more industrial than ever before. But this growth also led to a new question. Who gets to control all of that wealth and power? So this is another map just showing you the major railroads are in red. So pay attention to those. And you can really see how connected, remember the South before was not this connected. They barely had any tracks in Arkansas or anywhere. When we're talking about the Civil War. So you can see how industrialization really pushed for these railroads to be installed, because they're also, moving cotton out of this area, especially in the South, coal in this area, and then we do see tobacco still playing a big role. So as industries grew, businesses didn't just compete, they tried to eliminate the competition. And this is where we see the rise of big business. So first, economy of scale. The more a company produced, the cheaper each individual item became. So bigger companies had a huge advantage over smaller ones. Vertical integration. This is when a company controls every step of production, from growing and gathering the raw materials to manufacturing those materials to transportation to the sales. And a great example is Andrew Carnegie, who controlled the entire steel production process from beginning to end. There's also horizontal integration. This is when a company buys out its competition and just dominates an industry. An example of this, and you're going to read about this, is John D. Rockefeller, who controlled most of the oil industry. Let's look at corporations. So to support this growth, we see a rise of corporations. Corporations allow businesses to raise large amounts of money from investors, limit the financial risk, and continue operating beyond the life of one owner. And what we're going to see is this led to a rise of trust, monopolies, and massive business empires. But here's the problem. As corporations grew, so did concerns about their power. And many Americans began to ask, do these companies have too much control over the economy and even control over the government? And the answer is yes. So let's talk about the ideas that justified this system, right? One of the most important ideas was laissez-faire. So this is the belief that the government should stay out of the economy, and supporters believe that if businesses were left alone, the market would naturally create growth and prosperity. So this is really the foundation of capitalism. Another key idea is social Darwinism, right? Survival of the fittest was applied to fit society. And so the argument was if someone is wealthy, it's because they are more capable. If someone is poor, it's because they are less capable, which that is not true. But they also apply this to successes in businesses too. If you are successful, if your business, your corporation, your empire is successful, then that's just how it was meant to be. Because you are better, you are the fittest. But this idea, it's also used to justify inequality, right? Not everyone agreed though, and thank goodness not everyone agreed, in my opinion. Critics argue that poverty wasn't just a personal failure, it was the result of a larger economic system, and the government should step in and help. These debates over inequality and government responsibility will eventually lead to reform movements. And you'll read about those reform movements when we move into chapters 17 and 18. But here's something interesting. Even though the economy was changing rapidly, politics don't keep up with this rapid change. And the federal government during this time was relatively weak. Part of that is because we have all these progressive ideas and this idea about capitalism, but we are still disenfranchising minorities, right? So we are not allowing them to vote. We are taking the ability for them to vote away. We do this with poll taxes. We do this with literacy tests. We can see this especially in the South. When not everyone has a voice, you can't be very active. So politics are kind of at a stagnant place in history. Also, the weak presidencies do not help. If I asked you to go through and name these presidents that are pictured there at the bottom, would you be able to name all of them? Most of you are probably like, I recognize one or two, but I couldn't name all of them. And that's because during this time of history, the presidency, it's so weak because Andrew Johnson, that was the reason that it happened. During Reconstruction, the power of the presidency was taken and Congress took complete control of Reconstruction, and they also really took control of everything that was happening in politics. If you don't know who these guys are, this one really stops the weak presidency. He comes back in it, installs it, makes the presidency more powerful. But this guy, hopefully you recognize him if you know anything about the Civil War. That is Ulysses S. Grant, and he becomes president after Andrew Johnson. Then moving on from him, we have the next president, which is Rutherford B. Hayes, this gentleman. Then you have James Garfield. He's assassinated shortly after taking office, and his vice president, Chester A. Arthur, becomes president. Then we move down here. This is Grover Cleveland. He is the one who serves 2 non-consecutive terms. So he serves and then he sits out while Benjamin Harris comes into office. And then we go back to Grover Cleveland. And then the last one kind of finishing out this era of weak presidents is William McKinley. And we'll talk more about Roosevelt and Theodore Roosevelt and how he reestablishes the powerful presidency. But because of the weak presidency, politics are just, like I said, they're kind of stale during this time. The presidents have very limited power, and Congress was often divided and inefficient. So, there's a lot of instability of political power happening. And there's this chaotic atmosphere, and it really impedes progress in Congress. And it becomes more of like a spectacle, and you'll read about that in chapter 16, how people go and they still vote in large numbers, but it's really about like who can put on the best show as a politician, not who is the best for the job, who's the best to lead us, and make things happen. So at the same time, businesses, they do have a lot of influence, but many politicians also work closely with those corporations, and this led many Americans to believe that the government was corrupt, ineffective, or even controlled by the big businesses. And unfortunately, what ends up happening is we see a lot of corruption happening in these presidencies that they should have known about, and they claim, well, we didn't know it was happening. That's because your guys under you are being paid off. So despite those issues, though, people were very still engaged in politics. So we do see elections, like I said, people would come out and they were so competitive, they were emotional, they were highly attended. And during this time, voters are motivated by like party loyalty, religion, and even lingering Civil War divisions. So what's the big takeaway from like chapter 16 that you should get after reading it? So the late 19th century was a time of massive economic growth, major technological change, and the rise of powerful corporations. But we also see a lot of inequality, political weakness, we see corruption, we see growing concern about who really held the power. So as you move into the reading, keep this question in mind. Did industrialization create opportunity for everyone or just a few?